Hi, this is Catherine Brown, and this is my Multicultural Gifted Education final exam, my oral presentation. So the two course objectives that I chose, one was recognize prejudice and oppressive institutional structures in education that marginalize gifted students, or really students in general, from culturally diverse backgrounds. And the second one is examine historical, legal, and policy challenges, and triumphs faced by students from culturally diverse backgrounds. So for the prejudice and oppressive institutional structures, I chose several different areas on which to focus or briefly discuss. One of the main things I've learned in this course and in some other courses are some of the problems with assessments and testing, and Ford specifically goes over this, but one, the validity and reliability of assessments can often be difficult. You need to know, does the test for what is supposed to, and is it done in a consistent way? And this doesn't mean that results are always the same across the board, but is it consistent in that it fairly tests all students, so those from culturally diverse backgrounds as well. Scoring can be a problem, especially when you use value-added measures. There should really be a range of scores that are appropriate. And once again, cultural factors, different backgrounds can influence these scores. And as we saw in the YTB case number 3 for Jamin, this can cause implications for placement. For him, with the way Georgia laws were, a single score determined his identification for a gifted education. So once again, these can really have severe implications for when and where students are placed. There's also individual educator bias. So Ford went into some detail in this with Dwayne's case. The first time he was tested, he really kind of got a bad vibe from his psychiatrist who was implementing the test, which made him uncomfortable, and also the psychiatrist himself seemed kind of biased. He kind of read the situation as uncomfortable, or as Dwayne kind of being resistant, which could influence how he proctored the test. And then there's also curricular bias, which once again Ford discusses things like omitting certain topics from the curriculum, especially if they're culturally sensitive, perhaps minimizing certain groups, stereotyping, negatively representing groups, even if it's maybe something that's not done consciously. And ethnocentrism is a very big problem, specifically with the social studies. There's also the disenfranchisement of students. We saw this in the YTB case number 7 with Samuel, when he had kind of really a prejudicial teacher who almost ruined school for him. And luckily he had a great support system, but otherwise he was very marginalized. Ford also discusses the NAGC report on the status of gifted education, and kind of finds 4 big factors that really make gifted education continually problematic and that need to be addressed. Giftedness definitions are narrow, which means that the identification process is also narrow. There are limited offerings in certain grades, so certain grade levels, or even subject or content levels. You're not really reaching all students and their needs. There are superficial surfaces that really kind of seem great on the surface, but when you go deeper, they kind of lack content. And there's really a lack of understanding of individual as well as group needs. So what do individual students need, and what do groups, specifically culturally diverse groups, need? And there can be misconceptions from reform initiatives that really, they kind of enforce a quantity of reforms, but not a quality of reforms. They call for things like common curriculum instead of individualizing curriculum to particular students. And overall, there just seems to be a lack of equal access to education and educational opportunities, especially when you see high poverty groups. So for the historical, legal, and policy challenges and triumphs, with the Sputnik era, Ford kind of outlines this start of reform attempts and also kind of the start of gifted education. And this ran through the 1970s and 80s and culminated with the Javits Act, which attempted to expand and update gifted education, especially for those who are kind of more marginalized students. But as Ford found, it failed to mandate the creation of programs, and it included none of the due process safeguards for the students with disabilities. And unfortunately, the funding was cut for this. And of course, Brown v. Board was a big triumph educationally, but there still is not equal access and equitable access to education. And as Ford says, social conditions remain gloomy, especially with those high poverty students who just struggle to really get the fair education they need. Some of the sample cases that Ford goes over, Hobson v. Hansen, really kind of outlined that tests can yield biased results when they're standardized, in this specific case, on white middle-class populations and then administered to culturally diverse students. So this kind of lends an ear to the importance of making sure that tests are culturally sensitive and relevant to all students, not just some. Diana v. the California State Board. This was another one where IQ placement tests have to be in a student's native language, and they can't contain culturally unfair content. And this is kind of something I think that seems obvious, but is oftentimes overlooked. Sometimes we don't think about what might be culturally sensitive to certain groups. And finally, Larry P. v. Riles. This was another case in which students could be incorrectly placed because tests are culturally insensitive or biased. So these were kind of three big cases that had important outcomes for really more equitable standards for education and placement. As far as future plans, one important issue that's really stuck with me is recognizing the issue of socioeconomic status and educational equity and opportunity. So specifically speaking about kind of the lower income students, social factors go with this. They come from maybe single parent families. They have different family values or beliefs. There are peer pressures or social factors that Ford and several other authors talk about that can lend to kind of an excuse for low expectations. Teachers see them as being from these low poverty backgrounds and they won't achieve much, and then that kind of, I think, gets in the students' heads. They need to have high expectations too. And at the same time, poor districts simply can't afford to offer some of the same opportunities. So the system kind of continues in a cycle of, these low-income students who are kept in, low-income situations and aren't really given a chance to achieve. For networking and collaboration, one is the National Council for the Social Studies. Just because social studies focuses so much on civic competence, but as well as cultural competence, and that's for students and teachers. So this kind of provides kind of critical analysis and critical inquiry of our own beliefs as well as other beliefs. And also the American Educational Research Association. which really focuses a lot on research and implementing this research in a way that really raises not only awareness for education and problems, but also solutions to these problems. And this includes professional development, government relations and actions, and social justice.